It was 12:43 a.m. on a pitch-black highway in Burkina Faso when a police officer suddenly pulled a gun on President Ibrahim Traoré, a black man alone behind the wheel, facing a police officer with a badge and a weapon. But just 5 minutes later, it was that officer in handcuffs, his career and his freedom collapsing in front of flashing lights of a police car and a rolling camera. What exactly happened in those 5 minutes that flipped power upside down? And could a single phone video one day save President Ibrahim Traoré from injustice? It all began that night. It was the kind of African night that seemed to stretch on forever, a velvet sky glittering with stars so sharp they looked like they could slice through the darkness itself. Crickets sang like 1,000 tiny violinists hidden in the dry grass, and the soft wind carried the scent of dust and distant fires down the long, empty highway. Headlights crawled forward, casting slender fingers of yellow light across the cracked asphalt. At the wheel of a sleek black SUV was President Ibrahim Traoré, alone, his dark eyes scanning the road ahead while the faint glow of the dashboard painted shadows across his sharp cheekbones. His military jacket, usually crisp and imposing, lay unbuttoned around his shoulders as though the weight of an entire nation had finally forced him to loosen it. Inside the car, the radio buzzed with static before clearing into a highlife song whose cheerful horns felt almost ridiculous in the hush of the empty highway. Ibrahim shook his head and let out a dry laugh. "Politicians always get blamed for potholes," he muttered in French, glancing at a particularly nasty dip in the road ahead. "But nobody ever thanks us for the ones we fix." He swerved gently around it, his voice low, half speaking to himself, half to some invisible audience. "If someone finds out the president himself is dodging potholes at midnight, they'll probably blame me twice as hard tomorrow." There was humor in his tone, but also an exhaustion that made the laughter feel thin around the edges, like paper left too long in the sun. As he drove, the moon broke free of a bank of clouds, washing the world in silver. It turned the scrubby trees beside the highway into black lace and made Ibrahim's SUV shine like polished obsidian. He passed small villages where huts huddled together like secrets, fires glowing inside, families curled up on mats in the warm night air. Now and then, a stray dog trotted across the road, pausing just long enough to flash its eyes at the headlights before disappearing again into the brush. Ibrahim kept his hands steady at 10 and 2, but every so often he flexed his fingers against the leather wheel, trying to shake out the tension that had wound itself into his muscles after days of relentless meetings, calls, and the unending hum of crises that came with leading a country. Underneath the quiet humor flickered something deeper, a bone-deep fatigue that even the cool rush of night air through the half-open window couldn't wash away. He caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror, and for a second, he almost didn't recognize the man staring back, eyes shadowed, jaw set, the weight of responsibility pressing down like an invisible hand on his chest. He exhaled slowly, thinking of the files waiting on his desk, the names of men who wanted his seat, the silent prayers of millions who trusted him not to let them starve or fall to war or vanish into corruption. Still, he tried to push it aside. "Just a few more kilometers, Ibrahim," he murmured, leaning forward as if sheer willpower could pull the horizon closer. "Home, bed, 5 hours of sleep if God is kind." Yet the night seemed endless, the highway a ribbon stretching into blackness. And somewhere deep in his mind, a faint whisper warned him that the darkness ahead was hiding more than shadows. Though he tried to laugh it off, there was something electric in the air, a quiet crackle that made his skin prickle and his senses sharpen. Ibrahim was used to tension, to rooms full of generals and politicians with forced smiles hiding knives. But alone on this road, where the stars seemed to hang low enough to touch, he felt something different. A ripple of unease slithered up his spine. Though he couldn't name it, he knew enough to respect the instinct that had kept him alive this long. So he tightened his grip on the wheel, rolled his shoulders back, and told himself there was nothing out there except road, stars, and the usual African night. Yet a part of him, quiet and relentless, kept whispering that tonight would not be routine, that tonight, even for a president, the rules might suddenly change. Just as Ibrahim was letting the rhythmic hum of the tires soothe his thoughts, a violent burst of red and blue lights exploded behind him, shattering the midnight calm as if the stars themselves had caught fire. The siren came next, a rising, falling wail that slashed through the music on the radio and sent a jolt through Ibrahim's chest. His first instinct was pure disbelief. He blinked hard, staring into the mirror, then gave a small, incredulous laugh, the sound echoing off the windshield like a cracked bell. "Well, now I'm in trouble," he muttered in French, shaking his head as he eased his foot off the gas. "The president getting pulled over, that'll be a headline they'll love." The humor in his voice carried an edge of anxiety, as though he were trying to convince himself this was nothing but a ridiculous inconvenience. Still gripping the wheel, he flicked his eyes down to the speedometer, then back up, then down again, like a man searching for salvation. 65, not a kilometer over the limit. He hadn't swerved, hadn't missed a signal. He muttered under his breath, a running monologue laced with dry humor and faint exasperation. Maybe he's going to tell me my tail lights out, or that my presidential convoy is supposed to have flashing flags even at midnight. He snorted softly, though a bead of sweat trickled down his temple, betraying the strain underneath the jokes. The siren's wail tapered into silence, leaving only the staccato pulse of lights reflecting across his dashboard, as if the car were caught in the world's angriest disco. As he steered his vehicle gently onto the shoulder, the crunch of gravel under the tires sounded loud as gunshots in the hush of the night. He killed the engine, exhaled slowly, and rolled his window halfway down, reminding himself to keep his hands visible on the wheel. Even as president, Ibrahim knew there were rules for surviving encounters with men carrying guns and wearing badges. For a fleeting moment, he thought perhaps the officer might step out, recognize his face, and laugh off the stop as a harmless mistake. Yet the glimmer of hope fizzled the instant the cruiser's door swung open with a groan of metal. Out stepped Officer Moussa Traoré, framed by the harsh glare of headlights. He was shorter than Ibrahim had imagined but moved with the stiff-backed posture of someone who believed the entire road, and possibly the entire country, owed him respect. Moussa's face was locked in a scowl so severe it looked as though it had been carved in stone. His left hand hovered near his belt, fingers brushing the flap of his holster, while his right swung a flashlight back and forth like a weapon looking for something to strike. Ibrahim watched him approach, unable to stop his own wry observation from bubbling up. He looks angry enough to arrest a cloud, he thought dryly, almost amused despite the tension curling like smoke in his chest. Yet as Moussa drew closer, the humor in Ibrahim's mind shriveled beneath the weight of reality. The flashlight beam shot directly into his face, forcing him to squint and blink as spots of white floated in his vision. There was no greeting, no polite, "Good evening, sir." Only the harsh glare of the beam and a silence thick enough to taste. In that instant, the night turned from slightly absurd to dangerous, the laughter dying in Ibrahim's throat as he realized the man approaching his window did not look like someone prepared to share a joke or recognize a president. Officer Moussa Traoré stopped just inches from Ibrahim's open window, the flashlight beam boring into his eyes like a blade of white fire. For a moment, the only sounds were the soft static crackle of the police radio in the cruiser and the steady, wet click of Moussa chewing his gum with slow, deliberate rhythm. The gum popping between his teeth seemed absurdly loud in the silence, each smack echoing off the empty highway as if it were a taunt. Ibrahim blinked hard, trying to keep his face neutral, though his pulse began to pound a deeper, more urgent rhythm beneath his breastbone. He managed to summon the calm voice he'd used in countless tense meetings and military briefings. "Good evening, officer," he said in French, his tone measured, respectful, the words chosen like stepping stones over a river he dared not fall into. "Is there a problem?" But Moussa didn't return the greeting. He only leaned closer, his breath smelling faintly of mint and bitterness, and barked, "License. Registration." Ibrahim hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because he was unwilling to comply, but because there was something in Moussa's eyes, a flat, glassy stare that hinted at danger far beyond a simple traffic stop. Slowly, he reached for his wallet in the center console, narrating his every move. "I'm reaching for my documents," he said, voice low and deliberate, trying to de-escalate the moment. He slid out his driver's license along with his official presidential ID, the gold seal glinting even in the harsh light. He held them out, expecting at least a flicker of recognition, perhaps even an apology. But Moussa barely glanced at them, his lip curling in a sneer as though Ibrahim's credentials were counterfeit trinkets picked up at a market stall. "President, huh?" he scoffed. "Anyone can print a fancy card these days." Inside Ibrahim's head, a flicker of absurd humor sparked through the rising tension. He almost wanted to laugh, imagining how ridiculous it was for the president of Burkina Faso to be trying to prove his identity on a deserted highway. "Maybe I should have brought my campaign posters," he thought grimly. But even as the joke crossed his mind, a darker truth slithered in behind it, cold and sharp. His title might mean absolutely nothing to the man standing outside his window, chewing gum like it was a declaration of war. Then, without warning, Moussa's eyes narrowed further, and he spat the words, "Step out of the car." Ibrahim's mouth went dry. The demand wasn't shouted, but it carried the weight of a threat, as if 1,000 unseen consequences hung between each syllable. Ibrahim swallowed hard, keeping his voice calm though he felt the first genuine pulse of fear tightening in his chest. "Officer," he said, his tone firm yet conciliatory, "I've given you my identification. I don't understand why I need to step out." Musa didn't answer right away. Instead, he shifted his weight, shoulders tensing, and his fingers drifted lower on his belt. Then came a sound so soft it seemed impossible it could carry such lethal weight, a delicate click as Mouse's thumb unsnapped the leather strap on his holster. It was as if the night itself inhaled sharply. Ibrahim's ears rang in the silence that followed, his mind suddenly thrashing through every possibility, every headline he'd ever read about traffic stops spiraling out of control. His title, his rank, his reputation, all seemed laughably small compared to the stark reality of a gun half a second from being drawn. Despite the pounding of his heart, a twisted shred of humor wormed its way into Ibrahim's thoughts. "Fantastic," he thought wryly, his brain racing even as he tried to keep his face composed. "I survived coups, international plots, and rebel attacks, only to get shot by Officer Bubblegum on Route 14. He almost wanted to giggle, the absurdity of the situation pressing against his ribs like a cramp. But he kept his voice low and even, forcing himself to breathe. "Officer," he said again, each word careful as glass, "there's no need for this. Let's stay calm. If there's an issue, we can call your supervisor." But Musa leaned closer still, the flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. In his eyes, Ibrahim saw a dangerous glint, a man who wasn't just enforcing the law but relishing the power of deciding who had to obey. In that moment, the quiet African night felt as though it were teetering on a knife's edge, and Ibrahim knew that whether he lived or died might hinge on the next 10 seconds and the fragile hold he had on his own fear. Just when the silence between Ibrahim and Musa seemed ready to crack under its own weight, a voice shattered the night like a thrown stone. "Hey! I'm recording this, and it's going on Facebook, Instagram, and my cousin's WhatsApp." The words came flying out fast and loud, wrapped in a kind of fearless energy that made even the crickets fall silent for half a second. Both men turned sharply toward the roadside, where Fatou Diarra stood, one hand planted on her hip, the other holding up a smartphone that glowed like a small, defiant star in the dark. She was barely 5 feet tall, wearing a bright orange scarf that flapped in the breeze, and had the stance of a woman who'd stared down more than a few arguments at crowded markets and lived to tell the tale. Ibrahim blinked, momentarily stunned, not just by the absurdity of a live stream threatening to derail this deadly standoff, but by the fact that Fatou looked braver than he felt at that moment. There was humor bubbling up inside him despite the fear pressing hard against his ribs. Part of him wanted to laugh out loud, imagining how the scene must look from Fatou's camera, the president of Burkina Faso gripping his steering wheel for dear life while a police officer hovered with his gun half a thought away from being drawn. "I can't believe this might end up on my official social media," Ibrahim thought fleetingly, even as cold sweat beaded at his temples. But the humor was quickly tempered by relief, because Fatou's presence, her fearless voice cutting through the tension, shifted the atmosphere in an instant. Musa froze, the flashlight beam wavering slightly, his eyes flicking toward the glowing rectangle of Fatou's phone. A spark of something that might have been fear flickered across his face, quickly masked by renewed anger. "Put that phone down," he barked, his voice sharp-edged with panic that slipped out despite his best attempt at authority. But Fatou didn't even blink. She raised her chin higher, the camera lens aimed squarely at Mouse's face as though she were reporting live for national television. "You touch him, and tomorrow everyone in Burkina Faso and half the world is going to see your face," she shouted, her voice ringing with a clarity and confidence that sliced through the night air like a machete through cane. Ibrahim felt the shift happen as surely as if someone had flipped a switch. His own spine seemed to lengthen, his breath slowing, his pulse still racing but his mind clearing. For the first time since the flashing lights had appeared in his mirror, he felt the balance of power tilt ever so slightly back in his favor. He turned his head deliberately toward Musa, his voice suddenly stronger, carrying the weight and cadence of the leader who had rallied soldiers and citizens alike. "Officer Traoré," he said, his words precise and icy, "you are threatening the president of Burkina Faso without cause. Lower your weapon and step back. You are being recorded. This will not disappear." But the relief was short-lived, because Mouse's face twisted with a snarl, his eyes wide and wild as though he were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. His hand clenched tighter around the grip of his holstered weapon, the leather creaking under his fingers. For a heartbeat, silence hung between all three of them, a silence so deep that Ibrahim could hear the far-off howling of dogs in the village beyond the trees. The moment teetered, balanced on a knife's edge between salvation and disaster. Fatu's voice was steady as she declared, "The whole country's watching you now, officer." But Musa didn't relax. Instead, he took one step closer, eyes darting between Ibrahim and the phone's red blinking light, the threat of violence still pulsing in the narrow space between life and a headline no one would ever forget. The standoff felt like it might stretch on forever, frozen in a moment of trembling silence, when suddenly new headlights swung across the highway, slicing bright arcs of white and blue through the darkness. Gravel crunched sharply as another police cruiser rolled to a stop behind Mouse's vehicle. For a second, Ibrahim felt a flicker of hope, thinking reinforcements might finally inject reason into this spiraling chaos. But as the driver's door swung open and Officer Abdoulaye Sanogo stepped out, the hope faded into weary caution. Abdoulaye was a broad-shouldered man with a face as expressive as a brick wall, his jaw set so tightly that it seemed it might crack his teeth. He wore his cap low over his brow, casting his eyes into shadow, and carried himself with the heavy gravity of someone who'd seen every kind of trouble and grown thoroughly tired of it. Fatu, ever unable to hold her tongue even in the midst of near disaster, leaned closer to Ibrahim and whispered, "He looks like my uncle when someone forgets his birthday." Her comment burst into the scene like an unexpected splash of color, sharp enough that Ibrahim almost choked on a laugh despite the hammering tension pressing on his chest. The humor was infectious, absurd, and it briefly lifted the crushing weight of fear hanging over the roadside. Even the audience watching the scene would find themselves laughing at Fatu's irreverent commentary, unable to help but marvel at her audacity in the middle of what could still become a deadly encounter. But the laughter died as quickly as it came when Musa turned on Abdoulaye, his voice rising sharp and frantic. "He's resisting," Musa shouted, jabbing a trembling finger toward Ibrahim as though the president were some dangerous criminal lurking in the shadows. "He refuses to step out of the car. He's threatening me, and this woman is interfering with police business." The words tumbled out in a rush, pitched higher than before, as though Musa sensed the edges of his authority crumbling and was grasping wildly to stitch it back together. Abdoulaye's eyes flicked sideways to Ibrahim, then to Fatu, then finally to the phone still held high and unwavering in Fatu's small hand. The tiny red light on the camera blinked steadily, an unblinking witness recording every moment. For an instant, the only sounds were the distant chorus of cicadas and the soft rustle of dry grass swaying in the night breeze. The air seemed to tighten around them like the skin of a drum, ready to split at the slightest blow. Ibrahim watched Abdoulaye carefully, measuring every flicker of emotion that crossed the officer's stone-carved face. He could see the calculations flickering behind Abdoulaye's eyes, the weighing of loyalty against the weight of evidence, the dawning realization that this situation was not simply a matter of protocol but a public spectacle poised to explode. It was as if a crack had opened in the very foundation of power, letting in a shaft of blinding light that threatened to expose everything. Then Mouse's composure finally snapped. His face contorted into a mask of fury, veins standing out along his temples, his voice breaking into a near scream. "Don't listen to him, Abdoulaye," he shouted, spittle flying as he raged. "He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks his title makes him better than the rest of us. I'll lock him up myself if I have to." His hand darted again toward the grip of his holstered weapon, fingers tightening in a gesture so swift that it pulled the world taut with sudden, electric terror. Fatu gasped sharply, and even Abdoulaye's eyes widened fractionally, the mask of indifference slipping for the first time as he realized how close they were to bloodshed under the flashing lights. A hush settled over the highway like a blanket, smothering the world. The flashing lights spun slowly over anxious faces, glinting off metal and glass. Then, as if the night had decided enough was enough, another cruiser pulled up, tires crunching sharply over gravel as it rolled to a stop beside the chaos. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped Lieutenant Isufa Ouedraogo, a man who radiated the weary authority of someone who'd long since stopped being impressed or surprised by human stupidity. He was tall, his uniform pressed with razor creases, his eyes bleary as though pulled from bed only minutes earlier. He took one sweeping look at Musa, Ibrahim, Fatu still filming like a relentless news crew, and let out a slow, audible exhale, rolling his eyes skyward. He muttered under his breath, "I didn't wake up for this nonsense tonight." The words were dry as the desert wind, carrying just enough sarcasm to crack the tension and draw a startled snort of laughter from Fatu, who clamped her free hand over her mouth as if realizing too late that this was still deadly serious business. Ibrahim, sensing the momentary shift, inhaled deeply and forced his shoulders back, feeling the mantle of leadership settle around him like armor. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, but he summoned the same voice he'd used to speak to generals, foreign dignitaries, and citizens who trusted him to stand tall when things fell apart. "Lieutenant," he said, his words crisp and firm, resonant even in the chaos, "I am President Ibrahim Traoré. This officer stopped me without cause, drew his weapon, and threatened violence. This young woman has it all on video. I am ordering an immediate review of this officer's conduct and the release of any footage from police dash cams. I expect your cooperation." His voice didn't tremble, though he felt every cell in his body vibrating with the lingering charge of fear and fury. Lieutenant Isufa cocked one eyebrow, as though deciding whether he'd just stepped into a political scandal or a farcical comedy. Then his eyes slid to Musa, whose chest was heaving, face shining with sweat, eyes darting between Ibrahim and Fatou's implacable camera. The silence stretched thin as silk, filled only with the soft hum of police radios and the distant chorus of insects. Then, finally, Isufa spoke in a voice low and cool as riverstone, "Officer Caboret, is that true?" His tone held neither accusation nor sympathy, merely the weary patience of a man sifting through wreckage for facts. Mouse's jaw worked furiously, as though searching for words that refused to come. His voice cracked when he finally managed to spit out, "He was non-compliant. He thinks he's above the law because he's the president." But even as the words fell from his lips, they sounded brittle, like dry twigs snapping underfoot. Fatou stepped forward, the phone still held high, and snapped back, her voice slicing through the night air, "Non-compliant? He showed you his ID. You pulled your gun. You're the one who broke the law." For an instant, Musa looked like he might lunge forward, eyes bulging with a mixture of rage and desperation. But before he could take another step, Lieutenant Isufa raised one hand, palm outward, and barked, "Enough." The word cracked like a whip. The highway fell utterly silent, even the night creatures pausing as if waiting to see what would happen next. Isufa nodded once at Abdoulaye, who moved forward in a single, smooth motion, grabbing Mouse's arm with the kind of practiced authority that brooked no argument. Musa erupted, his voice spiraling into a high, panicked screech. "You'll all regret this," he screamed, fighting against the cuffs as they snapped shut around his wrists, metal biting into his skin. "I swear on my life, you'll regret this. I'm the law out here." His face twisted, spittle flying as he struggled, a man undone not merely by the consequences of his actions but by the abrupt, devastating collapse of the power he'd thought untouchable. His cries echoed off the empty highway, bouncing away into the darkness, leaving behind an almost eerie quiet as the officers began to lead him toward the waiting cruiser. Ibrahim stared at Musa as he was dragged away, his expression unreadable, though behind his steady gaze roiled a storm of sorrow and grim determination. He felt no triumph watching Musa in chains, only the hollow ache of witnessing how quickly authority could twist into cruelty, and how close even the highest office in the nation could come to becoming just another name on a tragic headline. He drew a slow breath, his chest rising and falling, eyes lingering on the spot where Musa had stood, as though trying to commit this moment to memory, not as a victory, but as a warning he'd carry with him forever. Fatou, lowering her phone at last, murmured under her breath, "Guess your potholes weren't the biggest problem tonight, Mr. President." Despite everything, a reluctant smile tugged at the corners of Ibrahim's mouth. Because sometimes, the only way to hold back the darkness was to find a reason, even the smallest one, to laugh. By dawn, the highway incident had already begun to spread like wildfire, igniting conversations in cafes, bustling markets, and government offices from Bobo Dioulasso to the dusty edges of the Sahel. Within hours, Fatou's grainy but unflinching video hit the internet, bouncing across social media platforms and ricocheting into newsrooms around the world. A flurry of news segments followed, featuring anchors from Paris to Johannesburg valiantly attempting to pronounce Ouagadougou with wildly varying levels of success. One newscaster managed to mangle it into something that sounded suspiciously like Waguji, while another, sweating under bright studio lights, trailed off halfway through, settling for an embarrassed cough and an apologetic smile. Audiences everywhere chuckled at the montage of linguistic misadventures, the humor providing a small but welcome relief from the weight of what the video revealed. Meanwhile, Fatou Diarra, once just another face in the crowd, found herself catapulted into sudden fame overnight. Her social media followers ballooned into the tens of thousands. Local radio hosts scrambled to book her for interviews, and strangers stopped her on the street to shake her hand or ask for selfies. She even appeared on a talk show, where the host introduced her with flamboyant flair as Burkina Faso's bravest citizen. Fatou handled it all with the same mixture of sass and humility that had made her a hero in the first place, though she couldn't resist telling the host, "I only did what any auntie with a phone would do. Besides, my cousin's WhatsApp group is still arguing about whether I should run for parliament." But the true heart of the story unfolded the next evening in a modest community center on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. The building, painted a faded peach color, stood under a row of tall acacia trees whose leaves whispered in the breeze like cautious gossip. The air inside was thick with heat and anticipation as chairs scraped across the concrete floor and neighbors squeezed in shoulder to shoulder, fanning themselves with scraps of paper or folded programs. Ibrahim arrived wearing a simple white shirt and dark slacks, stripped of his formal trappings, looking less like a president and more like any man from the neighborhood who'd come to listen. As he stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell into a hush, eyes fixed on him with a mixture of curiosity and cautious hope. He began slowly, his voice carrying the same steady cadence that had once calmed soldiers on the front lines and soothed anxious parliamentarians during stormy debates. "My friends," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "I am here because of what happened the other night. But more than that, I am here because what happened to me has happened to so many others, without cameras, without witnesses, and without justice." A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, some heads nodding, others bowed as though recalling private sorrows they rarely spoke aloud. Then came the stories, one by one. People rose to speak, each voice carrying its own weight. A man in his 60s, with a booming laugh, told how a police officer once accused him of stealing his own bicycle, prompting Fatou to shriek from her seat, "Was it at least a good bicycle?" sending the room into a burst of laughter. A young mother, voice trembling, described her husband being detained for hours over a broken tail light while she waited home, terrified, with 2 small children. The crowd grew still, the laughter fading into silence so profound it seemed to hold its breath. An older woman with silver-threaded hair stood, her voice rich with quiet authority, and spoke of her son who'd left for school one morning and never returned, lost somewhere between a police checkpoint and the thin pages of a government report stamped closed. Fatou, unable to stay seated any longer, bounded up to the microphone and declared, "We can't wait for cameras to save us every time. We all have to be cameras for each other, eyes open, phones ready, voices loud." Her words rang out, echoing off the high walls, striking chords deep in every heart present. Applause thundered around the room, rolling like distant drums across the concrete floor. Some clapped with tears streaming down their cheeks, others laughing through the wetness, because in Burkina Faso, as in so much of the world, the line between tragedy and resilience often blurred. As the meeting stretched into the night, Ibrahim felt something shift inside him, a sense that this room, filled with laughter and sorrow, was the true seat of power, more significant than any marble hall or presidential office. When he finally stepped away from the podium, people crowded around, gripping his hands, patting his shoulders, thanking him not just for being president but for being willing to listen. And as the community center's doors swung open into the warm night air, the noise of conversation and laughter spilled out into the darkness, carrying the promise that sometimes justice didn't begin in courtrooms or palaces, it began wherever ordinary people stood together and refused to look away. As the echoes of applause faded into the warm night outside the community center, Ibrahim stood quietly near the podium, watching the people filter out in small clusters, their voices low but electric with shared purpose. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed softly, throwing a pale glow over the worn concrete floor. For a long moment, he didn't speak, his eyes following Fatou as she posed for another photo, laughter erupting when someone teased her about her new celebrity status. Then, slowly, Ibrahim turned his gaze directly toward the camera, as though looking into the eyes of each person watching. His voice calm and steady, but carrying the weight of a man who had seen both the worst and the best of human nature. "It's easy to think your title protects you," he said, the words rolling out with quiet gravity. "But the truth is, titles are just words. They can't stop a bullet. They can't shield you from fear when a gun is pointed in your face. Justice isn't about titles, it's about truth, and about people brave enough to stand up and say, no more." He paused, his jaw tightening, eyes glistening just enough to catch the light, though his voice did not waver. "That night, I learned something I thought I already knew. Power without accountability is just tyranny waiting for a chance. And sometimes, the strongest person isn't the one with the uniform or the badge, it's the one holding up a phone, or refusing to look away." He exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight that had been pressing on his ribs all this time, and a faint, tired smile curved his lips. I survived that night because someone decided to stand up. Someone decided the truth was more important than fear. Fatou stepped forward, slipping easily beside him, her scarf bright under the lights, her eyes sparkling with fierce determination and humor. She lifted her chin and spoke with a clarity that rang like a bell. "Your phone is more powerful than you think," she declared, glancing around as though daring anyone to disagree. "Don't look away. Don't tell yourself it's not your business. Because if you don't record it, if you don't speak up, who will?" Her voice trembled for just an instant, then steadied again, each word punching the air like a drumbeat. "We have to protect each other. That's how we win." Ibrahim turned back to the camera, and for the briefest moment, a softness crossed his features, a flash of vulnerability beneath the steel. "We owe it," he said, his voice low, every syllable etched with purpose, "to those who never got their 5 minutes, to those whose stories ended without witnesses, to those who couldn't fight back because no one was there to see. Let's be their witnesses. Let's be their voices. And let's make sure that next time, nobody faces the darkness alone." He let the silence hang for a heartbeat, as if inviting every listener to absorb the weight of the vow. Then he nodded once, firmly, as though sealing a promise that stretched far beyond the edges of the camera's frame. And as the screen began to fade to black, the last thing the audience saw was Fatou's determined smile and Ibrahim's resolute eyes, shining with the fierce conviction that justice, once awakened, would never again go quietly into the night. The characters and events portrayed in this story, including Ibrahim Traoré, are entirely fictional and do not represent real individuals or actual events. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. This story is created solely for entertainment and educational purposes. Asterisk if you enjoyed this story.